Hi, everyone. I'm Tara Durheim, the marketing director at Liturgical Press, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar as Francis reforms the Curia, what Catholics need to know, a conversation with Massimo Fagioli and Cindy Wooden. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping notes for everybody. First, all attendees are in listen-only mode, so your cameras and mics have been turned off. Also, we are recording today's live webinar, so we will email everyone a link to that recording after today's event. So if you can't stay for it all, you will get a recording of the full conversation. And this conversation will certainly be informative, so we anticipate that you'll have some questions for us. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask questions throughout the conversation, and all those questions will be answered at the end. Also, as a registered attendee, I have to share that you are you have the option and the wonderful ability to order Massimo's new book, the new introduction to the Apostolic Constitution, Preach the Gospel. If you head on over to litpress.org and enter the code REFORM, you can order a copy and get 30% off and free shipping. So with that, I'm going to pass over the conversation to our director, Therese Ratliff, to introduce our speakers today. So, Therese, take it away.
Hi, everyone. As Tara said, I'm Therese Ratliff, the director of Liturgical Press, and I am so happy to be able to welcome you all to today's conversation on Pope Francis' reform of the Roman Curia. As everyone on this conversation call knows, earlier this year, the Pope promulgated an apostolic constitution, Predicati Evangelium, that in many ways seemed like it would be solely a bureaucratic document dealing with the nuts and bolts of running the church as an organization. However, as people started to read and study the document, many people started to believe that this could quite possibly be the most important action of Pope Francis' papacy, one that would set a vision and shape the church in profound and really lasting ways. So if that's true, then the question arises, what does this mean for bishops and academics and professionals in the church? And what does it mean for the wider people of God, for those of us who call ourselves Catholic and who call the church our home? We have with us today two eminently qualified voices in the Catholic world to discuss this topic. Dr. Massimo Fagioli is a professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University. He is an internationally known columnist and presenter on church history, theology, politics, and culture. He is the author of numerous books, the most recent of which forms the basis for today's conversation, an appraisal of Francis' reform on the Curia, published by Liturgical Press. And Cindy Wooden is the chief of the Rome Bureau of Catholic News Service. She is a longtime reporter on the Vatican and the Catholic Church and has traveled around the world with Popes John Paul II, Benedict, and now Francis, making her a well-respected authority on the life and workings of the Church. And she is also the author of two books published by Liturgical Press. So Massimo and Cindy, welcome. We are so happy to have you with us. And I will turn this conversation on the reform of the Curia over to you.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you, Cindy, for being here. So I think this document that Pope Francis published just 6 months ago in March is the most important so far of the pontificate because it recapitulates so many of the aspects of his message, of his words, and of his actions. But I think it's important to take a little step back before. Why are the reforms of the Roman Curia important in church history? So first of all, it's because they happen quite rarely. So the Curia, as we know it, by this name of the Vatican, is a creation of the 16th century. And there are just 4 or 5 dates that have shaped the form of the Roman Curia. One is the modern foundation of the Roman Curia in 1588, after the Council of Trent, the system for congregations, basically stable congregation, permanent congregations, 1588. The second one is 1908, Pope Pius X reform, which came almost 40 years after the end of the Papal States in 1870, and it realized that the end of the Papal State meant that the old Curia, which was also a secular state administration, made no sense, and so it had to be rethought as administration for the church only. And then we have the 2 previous reforms before Pope Francis, which is the reform of Paul VI in 1967, immediately after Vatican II, but that in some sense it's a reform that only partially takes into account Vatican II, because as a young Monsignor, Montini had worked in the Vatican before becoming bishop, before becoming cardinal. And then there's John Paul II Constitution of 1988, Pastor Bonus, which is very important because it's in the middle of Pope John Paul's pontificate. It comes after the Code of Canon Law of 1983, and it is a consolidation in some sense of the reform of Paul VI of 1967. So here Pope Francis' reform of 2022, I believe, is important because it's part only of a small number of key moments when we can say something has changed in the. Why is this reform important in Pope Francis' pontificate? For a few reasons. First, because Pope Francis has said explicitly that he and the Council of Cardinals that he created 4 weeks after being elected have been working at this for 9 years. So this is a very, very important project that, I mean, from day one, Pope Francis had in mind, and even the conclave that elected him had in mind. Second, because it is not just a bureaucratic rekindling of an existing structure, but it has in itself, I believe, one of the key feature of this pontificate, which is the Catholic Church is more global than before. It's not Rome center as it used to be. It must be more sensitive, more attentive, more receptive to the fact that the church is much more global. The role of the bishop conferences is quoted much more often in this constitution than before. And third, I would say, lastly, everything for Pope Francis has to do with a vision of the church, which is missionary, evangelizing, and trying to get rid of clericalism, of a certain grip of the clergy to power, even administrative power, and so on. So this is why, in a nutshell, just as an introduction, I believe this constitution is very important. A few questions are open. How it will be implemented, what will be the outcome of this. As a scholar, as an academic, I have more distance with the Roman Curia geographically. But if there's someone who has worked with that in that environment, much more than I have, is Cindy. And so she is eminently qualified to give us her take. What is her impression, her analysis of this document that was published 6 months ago, but it is still being implemented, by the way. So we are still seeing steps to give shape to this document. So Cindy, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Massimo. This will be interesting. Among the things I want to say, Pope Francis's constitution emphasizes the missionary mandate of the Curia offices, but the main thrust and the most practical impact, I think, is service. Since the early days of his pontificate, long before the Constitution was promulgated, Pope Francis has tried to chip away at any sense that because the Curia is at the center of the church, it is the center of the church. When the US bishops, for example, when the US bishops made their ad limina visits in late 2019 and early 2020, one thing I heard over and over again was how much the meetings at the Curia offices had changed since their last ad limina 8 or 9 years previous. Gone, the bishop said, were the lectures and the sense of being called on the carpet and given marching orders. Instead, they said, the Curia officials wanted to know what the bishops needed from them and how they could help. And with a few exceptions of an official or two who would rattle on and on about his pet project, the bishops said they felt that this was very sincere. And they experienced that from the Pope himself. I mean, they were blown away by the 2.5, 3 hours that they spent with him, just asking questions and hearing his responses and having him ask them questions. It was much less formal than the ad liminas have been in the past and made them feel like their ministry was being recognized and valued. Listening to the bishops made me wonder what kind of experience Archbishop Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Buenos Aires had when he made his ad limina visits, although I couldn't find any traces of him talking about it, so can't know for sure. At a Georgetown discussion in 2019, Cardinal Wilton Gregory said, quote, "He is a pope who never worked in Rome, and that is real clear in the way he looks at the organizational structure there." So kind of interesting. The Pope's push for an attitude of service, I think, is helped by the very practical step in the Constitution of putting limits on the time that priests and religious can serve at the Vatican. It's 5 years, renewable once, although I think it remains to be seen if those limits will be enforced. Some of the offices are very specialized, and the top officials understandably don't want to lose people who know the material and do the work well. On the other hand, people acting like they were ordained to work in the Curia or who give off this sense of, being on a Curia career track, they obviously have a stake in perpetuating their position and any power it might be perceived to have. Kind of touching on one thing that Massimo said in passing, Archbishop Marco Molino, who's secretary of the Pope's Council of Cardinals, which drafted the Constitution with the Pope, gave a long speech about it in May to members of the Curia. He focused on service, including, interestingly, service to the world's bishops. The Curia, he said, is to be of service to the Pope, the successor of Peter, and to the bishops, the successors of the apostles. The Curia's service, he said, is, quote, expressed in its dedication to the good of the universal church and at the same time of the particular churches. It exists and acts only insofar as it serves the Holy Father in his name and with his authority. At the same time, he said, the activity of the Roman Curia cannot ignore its relationship to the ministry of the bishops, both as members of the College of the Bishops, as well as pastors of the particular churches, dioceses, eparchies. It is, in fact, an instrument of communion, the Curia, and participation in the Pope's concern for the whole church. Precisely by virtue of this diaconia, he said, connected with the Petrine ministry, the Roman Curia is therefore, on the one hand, very closely united with the bishops of the whole world, and on the other hand, the bishops themselves and their churches are the first and principal beneficiaries of this work. It's important to note that Bishop Molina was not talking only about the ministry of an individual bishop in his diocese, but the communion and the common efforts of bishops collaborating to address national or regional concerns through bishops' conferences and regional councils. Esteem for the conferences had hit a low point during the pontificate of St. John Paul II, but Pope Francis, who was very active in CELAM, the Latin American Bishops' Council, quickly changed that. I think it was very noticeable in his first exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, where he cited half a dozen statements published by bishops' conferences around the world. He was pointing to them and saying that their teaching has authority, and he was embracing that in his own magisterium. Showing respect for visiting bishops is one thing, but the Curia being at their service is something else. It's possible that an attitude change will be the biggest and perhaps only change to be made in some offices. Well, that and getting new letterhead that says dicastery instead of congregation or council. But the dicastery for promoting integral human development, that's a mouthful, seems to have taken a much more radical approach. Born in 2017 of the merger of the Pontifical Councils for Justice and Peace, for migrants, for healthcare workers, and for charity, the dicastery had separate desks or sections for those issues for the past 5 years. The dicastery announced a major reorganization precisely to respond to the concerns of bishops and churches around the world. Adapting the See, Judge, Act approach common to the application of Catholic social teaching, the dicastery says that it is now organized. Sorry, I lost my place. It is now organized. I'm sorry. The dicastery is now organized in 3 sections. The first is listening and dialogue, which is supposed to promote two-way contact with bishops and Catholic groups engaged in justice and peace work. A research and reflection section to study the issues and concerns raised by the bishops and those groups, and a communication restitution section that is supposed to ensure that the results of the research are formulated in tangible and understandable ways, and then returned to the local churches or the groups that asked for that information to begin with. The dicastery says its agenda will be shaped, quote, by the challenges which the local churches bring to our attention, and it expects that those challenges will shift over time. While changes in the Constitution fit nicely with Pope Francis's vision of ministry in the church, he recently said that drafting the new Constitution was not his idea, but was something the cardinals called for in 2013 when they met to discuss the state of the church before the conclave that elected him, and Massimo referred to that. He told the Argentinian news agency Telam just a month or two ago that the reform of the Roman Curia was, quote, neither my invention nor a dream I had after a night of indigestion. I gathered everything that we, the cardinals, had said at the pre-conclave meetings, the things we believed the new pope should do. Then we spoke of the things that needed to be changed, the issues that needed to be tackled. I carried out the things that were asked back then. I do not think that there was anything original of mine, he said. One of the major changes in the Constitution is the explicit affirmation that lay people can and should hold important roles in the Curia, and that they can even lead dicasteries. In fact, Cardinal Kevin Farrell told America Magazine that he could be the last cleric to serve as president of the dicastery for laity, the family, and life. That's an obvious office to begin with, if you're going to put a layperson in charge, I think. But there are practical obstacles to appointing lay people to those top offices, including money and availability, but also perceived issues of hierarchical authority. After all, previously at least, when an archbishop was appointed head of a congregation, it was assumed he would become a cardinal soon because an archbishop could never have authority over a cardinal. When Pope Francis gathered the world's cardinals together August 29th to 30th, a couple of weeks ago, to discuss the Constitution, the role of lay people and their eventual leadership of some dicasteries was one of the topics, according to the way Vatican News described it. The Vatican Press Office provided no details of the discussion, however. Cardinal Lo Giudice of Siena told Avvenire that the meeting was an opportunity to help the cardinals understand some elements that are less clear, less evident. In particular, he said, the one concerning the presence of lay people, even in the highest offices of the dicasteries. This is an open door that we hope can be entered in the best possible way, he said. But he did not say exactly what was perplexing to the cardinals about the whole notion. Factors that have made it difficult to get more lay people, even in mid-level Vatican positions, include the need to speak Italian, something which can be learned, but which clerics who studied in Rome have a jump on, the flexibility to move to Rome for a 5-year term, which could become a 10-year term, and the modest size of Vatican salaries, which can support a religious or a cleric or someone whose spouse is also working in Italy, but would be difficult for many professionals supporting a family. Of course, how the Pope's vision for the Curia will be implemented will depend to a large extent on who is appointed president of the various dicasteries and on how that person interprets the Pope's wishes. It would seem to be much easier to delay making any significant changes to the way an office works than to jump in wholeheartedly. And I guess with that, one of the questions I thought would be interesting to ask Massimo is kind of who gains power, authority, influence in this reform, do you think? And kind of who loses it?
So one thing that I always tell my students is if you have to make a wager, make a bet on who wins and who loses in church history in the long term, I always say to them, always bet your money on the papacy. The papacy always wins for different reasons, okay? And I think that this reform of the Curia is very much Franciscan or Bergoglian, if you want. But there is a certain, in my opinion, tendency to verticalize some mechanisms within the Curia directly to the Pope. This is something that is not because of Francis. This is how the whole structure has been developed in these last few centuries. And the question is, can this tendency be changed? Okay, so that's one thing. This reform makes the intuitions of Francis on the church and so on much more foundational to the whole Curia structure, but also mentality. Okay, so as an historian, I mean, it strikes me because the Curia for centuries has been seen something like a necessary evil that has no theological essence. Okay, well, Francis has tried to say in his speeches and so on to the Roman Curia, this is like a small church, this is like a Christian community. So he is trying to give some theological substance to the Roman Curia. Okay, so here I believe this reform accentuates some pre-existing tendencies to papalize everything in terms of less, or I mean, the invitation to work synodally in this document is still largely an invitation. There are no mechanisms that change the system of the 19th, 20th century, which is made of separate dicasteries work independently, and then they report to the Pope. That's the new system of these last couple of centuries. Especially one choice that could have been made was a return to the medieval or early modern period of a consistorial system where there are more meetings of more cardinals, bishops, lay people that work in the Vatican independently of the dicastery they belong to. Okay, but that would have required a real revolution. And so this reform is a reform, not a revolution. Okay. Second, as you said, the point on lay people is very, very important. So you laid out very, very effectively the practical problems here. But there's also one theological problem that I think is what they talked about in the consistory. And I can understand why Vatican News didn't want to report on it, because it is very delicate. According to the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, you have power in the church, power that is sacramental, but also of jurisdiction, of making decisions that have legal consequences for other members, because you have been sacramentally ordained to do that. Okay, so this was a big achievement of the Second Vatican Council 60 years ago, because the idea was we should give the idea that everything we do in the church has a sacramental foundation, not just juridical, legal, right? Now, what is the new problem of these last 60 years? That if you found every power ministry in the church on the sacrament of ordination to the priesthood or consecration for bishops, you are excluding automatically half of the Catholic Church, I mean, women and many lay people. So the Constitution made this decision to say that to serve in the Roman Curia, you may serve not only because you have been ordained, but also because of the mission that the Pope gave you. Okay, so this could be the solution against the exclusion of the lay people and of especially women. But it creates also a certain tension with the theology of the Second Vatican Council, which said that every position of authority in the Catholic Church, included in the Curia, has to be founded on a sacramental basis. Okay, this is a big problem that no constitution in itself can solve. But it was interesting, for example, that in the weeks after the Constitution was published, you had a series of articles in the Osservatore Romano of different cardinals arguing for different positions. That is very rare to see, okay? So this is something that remains to be seen. What will be the solution found to the practical problems that you mentioned, but also to this idea that you may have people working in the Curia with a power of jurisdiction, I mean, legal power of making decisions, even if they're lay people, if they're women, okay? Because this is really uncharted territory, because we never saw that. And of course, you mentioned here the radical approach to the reform by the Dicastery for Human Development. One important factor is what is going to be the difference in implementing this in new dicasteries, like on development, and the old ones. Very importantly, the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, right? Because that changes a lot. I mean, if you are a dicastery that was created by Pope Francis 6 years ago, it's easier in any sense to, update quickly. Right. If you were founded 5 centuries ago, it takes more work, it takes more time. And this is not something that can be legislated upon. I mean, you cannot legislate on mentalities, on cultures, on people behaviors. This is going to be very interesting how it plays out in these next few weeks, months, and years, because this reform will have a long life, I guess. I mean, popes don't have a great appetite for these big reforms. Right. When they do this, it's because the assumption is this will last for a generation at least, as it happened in this last century.
When in your introduction and in the new book and in your talk, you talked about how the Pope actually gains power in this model, that it's more vertical. What do you think are, obviously that would have you would feel differently about that depending on how you felt about the Pope who was in office at the time. No, what do you think the positives and negatives of that are? That the Curia serves basically at the pleasure of the Pope, and its authority is delegated by him.
So I think this more papal character of the Curia has been visible also in these last 9.5 years of Pope Francis, because in my opinion, he has decided to limit more than in the past the autonomy of some key centers within the Vatican, especially the former Holy Office, the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, and especially, I would say, the Secretariat of State. This could be a big change, because one of the big changes that after Vatican II, Paul VI reform decided, and John Paul II accepted in 1988, is that the Secretariat of State was not just the Department of Foreign Affairs. Mm-hmm. It was also the neuralgic center of the Curia. It was the place where it was the super dicastery, in some sense. So in 1967, the reform was imagined largely by a Francophile like Paul VI as a semi-presidential system. So where there's the president, who is the Pope, and a prime minister who was the Secretary of State. With Pope Francis, I don't think we can say that. We have that the Secretariat of State has become much more in charge of international issues of affairs and less within the Roman Curia, as we have seen in the last few years, the decision of taking away some financial funds and abilities to deal with that from the Secretary of State. So that, I mean, obviously, if you like what a pope is doing, you like a more papalist Curia. Of course, I mean, these reforms have a long life, and so this might give us different kinds of outcomes. One thing that I expected to see, or I was curious to see, was, for example, if Pope Francis decided to include in the new Roman Curia the Council of Cardinals, that because that would have been revolutionary. And instead, we don't know what will happen to this Council of Cardinals after Pope Francis is gone. It is very likely that it will never be called again. It will disappear with him. Okay, so this is a reform that is very Bergoglian in language, in openness. I mean, there's one shocking, very interesting passage where in the paragraph on dealing with new issues with family, marriage, there is one sentence dealing with Christians in situation of polygamy. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine that? It was really shocking to see a Vatican document acknowledging that there are some areas of the world where this is a real issue. So I believe it's still early to see what will be the outcome. I mean, Francis legislates incrementally usually, so it is very likely that some laws will be added in time to this. But I believe this is very much in his image. It is in my opinion, the most important document because it's Francis working hard for doing something that is not him.
Interesting.
When it's him, I mean, when he speaks with people, it's him.
Right.
When he legislates, he's really working hard to do that job.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And so this is an interesting document because you see a very long process of thinking, of pushback, of back and forth, and so on. It's a mediation between his dream and the practical aspects of governing. But it's another side of this pontificate that I believe requires more explanation than other documents that are more plain or more, I mean, to the level of an easy understanding. That's what I'm saying.
I was wondering what you think too of the way bishops and especially bishops' conferences are treated. I mean, like after Apostolos Suos in 1998 seemed to tell bishops that, you know, it's really nice if you get together as a conference and do things together, but we don't really take that seriously. And right. Nothing that you do together is as important as what an individual bishop does in his diocese. Pope Francis, I mean, it was striking from Evangelii Gaudium and especially in Laudato Si, how much he cites the teaching of bishops' conferences as actual magisterial. What do you think about how the bishops' conferences are and bishops are described and presented in this document?
This is very different. I mean, just from a simple word count, I mean, bishop conferences are mentioned, I think, 58 times or something. So this is a really new thing. It is still at the level of aspiration and of encouragement to the Curia mentality culture to behave differently. And this has happened already because, as you said, I've heard myself from some bishops, our last ad limina was different, right? Mm-hmm. But it's interesting because there's this paragraph on the structure of the ad limina visits. I mean, the visits that every bishop conference has to make every 7 years, more or less. Yeah. It is, yeah, because
now we're like 9, 10.
Everything is delayed now, but that section has very few changes from Pastor Bonus of 1988, but you see a certain direction towards a more dialogical, a less top-down approach. The same thing can be said for that paragraph on the dicastery for the bishops, for that part on the process of appointing bishops. It is very similar to the Constitution of 1988, but there are small additions that you can see. They realize that the participation of the people is now a universally acknowledged issue. So there are no structural changes made in this document on the process, but there is a different culture, a different image of how the Curia should relate to the local church. And it's the image of service to the Pope upstream and to the local churches downstream. But one of the things that is interesting is that if you compare the situation today, this document, Pope Francis, Vatican, and so on, with what was said by many commentators immediately after Vatican II, many thought, well, we will no longer have a Vatican. It will not be in Rome anymore. We should decentralize everything a little bit in America, a little bit in Middle East. That hasn't happened. Rome is still Rome. The Vatican is still the Vatican. So there's a persistence or a resilience of those institutions, those buildings, but also of that symbol that is not hard to decentralize. It is very, very complicated. You had cardinals in the late 60s who were bishops of their city, like in Canada, and at the same time a prefect of a dicastery in the Vatican. It didn't last long. I mean, it was realized that you have to be in Rome to be in charge of a dicastery. So it's an extremely fascinating object to look at this institution, which is usually assumed to be unchangeable, but actually there are so many little things that have been moving for centuries.
Interesting. I don't know, do we want to move to the questions?
Sure.
Yes, so thank you for that, Cynthia and Massimo. We have some really interesting questions here. There is a question that has lit up the Q&A box several times, and that is regarding the sacramental foundation for the authority of the Curia. Wouldn't baptism be the foundational sacrament that we're referring to that gives this authority? This person says it seems it's simply adding a mission from the Pope while keeping the ministerial ordination as the sacramental foundation for that authority still supports clericalism within the structure. So can you speak about baptism as that foundational sacrament?
Right. The problem is that according to canon law, I mean, Code 129, the power of jurisdiction is given not by baptism, but by ordination. That is a canonical thing, but the more noble argument that was made at Vatican II is that if you disconnect the legal power, let's say, from being ordained, the risk is ultimately that you will make every top official in the church a political appointee of the Pope, who would become like a CEO or a political leader. So the argument was at Vatican II, if it is the sacrament that gives authority to govern in the church, you will make these people who are in position of authority more dependent, not on the hierarchy, but on the gospel, which is theologically a very powerful argument, right? Also because we now know very well how a certain technocratic culture of human resources, with all the niceties of the good words, nice words, and so on, but it has become more ruthless. Okay, so here the one question is, we need to have more lay people, more women, absolutely yes. But how can we do this without distorting a hierarchy that should be founded on the authority of the sacrament on the basis of the gospel rather than on a purely hierarchical mentality? That is the million-dollar question. And I think, actually, I know that they talked about that in the consistory, because this has become a question that is much more complicated than left-right, or I like Francis, I don't like Francis. This is really a theological question that we need to face think we are in a situation that's different from the times of the Second Vatican Council.
And I think we're also, the question gets complicated by kind of modern, very sad experiences of how ordained people have acted and betrayed the church. I mean, the way you break the tie between ordination and clericalism isn't by getting rid of the clergy. It's by rethinking what it means to be ordained to serve, and the whole exercise of authority as service rather than as a power grab. I mean, I think that's what Pope Francis is after. He doesn't want to get rid of ordination or priests or bishops or cardinals or popes, but he does want to get rid of clericalism.
Clericalism. So as a follow-up to that, there's another question here. How have the US bishops responded to this document?
Cindy.
Well, no, okay, I haven't seen a whole lot. I mean, I do think this question of, what will the implications of this be for Catholics in the pews, Catholics in other countries, I think that it remains to be seen. I mean, in my reading of it, I was very much focused on what it meant for how things will work here in Rome. So I'm not sure.
I mean, liturgical press would be happy to know that some of them asked advanced proofs of this book, because to me, and so they were looking forward to know more. And you're right. I think that the reception has been positive because of what they experienced in their ad limina of 2019, which I heard was very different from the previous one of 2012. which was one moment when many of them felt actually scolded like school children. So this is part of a certain new relationship that there is between many of the US bishops and Pope Francis.
Now, here's another interesting question. In order to have the results that Francis is looking for regarding reform in the church, doesn't there have to be a total restructuring of seminaries and the curriculum in seminaries? That speaks to the clericalism that you were talking about, Cindy.
Well, I agree. The same should be said for theological institutes of higher education. I mean, the theologians as well. So there is an institutional genius in the Catholic Church that must be understood to understand what kind of church you are in. So yes, I think this is one issue on which I think Francis has been cautious, because I think he thinks this is the job for the next guy, because this is an enormous chapter. Because as we know, I mean, Vatican II changed very marginally the seminary as institution, which is still a creation of the age of, I mean, after Trent. So absolutely, that's true. But if we think that we need in the Vatican more lay people, my opinion is we need more lay people, but also new lay people, not lay people as we have known them, in some cases more clerical than the clergy, right? So it's not just if you have a collar or not, but it's a cultural issue which is transversal, I would say.
I think also the Pope recognizes that the issue of seminaries and seminary education is also a very culturally specific topic. If you look at the results of the synod for the Amazon region, I mean, there was a lot of focus there about how they could reform their seminaries for ministry in their region, and it's very specific. It's not I mean, I think that's going to have to happen on kind of a regional or national level.
Yeah. I agree.
A couple people here have asked a really interesting practical question. Who finances the Curia? Where does the money come from to fund this kind of operation?
You do. It's Peter's Pence, mainly. And it is also dioceses make donations to the Vatican, religious orders make donations to the Vatican, but I think the biggest chunk money is Peter's Pence and investment income and rental income from buildings of various states of repair and disrepair throughout Italy.
Right. Yeah, one more thing maybe is that so far we had lived, I mean, so far in these last few centuries, we have lived with a Curia which was a low cost kind of, I mean, there's this, I mean, Dan Brown-esque imaginary of, but it's a very, I mean, on a shoestring budget and so on. So one question is, can we have a more modern, less clerical Curia that is not going to bankrupt the whole thing, right? Because that is a practical issue that is not ideological. Also because we have heard in the past that it has been possible, or it was, I mean, talked about, to make high-profile hires in the Vatican, and then to have some private donors, pay for that salary. Well, that may be a more specialized personnel. I think there's a conflict of interest there. So there's some decisions that will have to be made that will be non-ideological, but very practical. More clerical curia means low cost.
Right.
More lay people means higher costs. That's what is on the table, I guess.
Sure. There's a question here. If bishops are going to be empowered to receive direction from the Vatican, aren't some kind of rules needed to assure that transparent performance standards for bishops are respected and accountability is assured?
Yes, there should be. There aren't that much. One of the game-changing factors has been, obviously, in these last 2 decades at least, the sex abuse crisis. That has put much more pressure on the bishops as a vocation, as a position. One problem that the church is facing now is that many good candidates for bishops, they turn down. This is a real problem. This is something that is happening, I think, not as quickly as we would like it to happen, but this is happening. The age of the monarch without any accountability is over, at least in the churches in the Western world, more than other areas that have other problems, okay? It's not an easy job to be a bishop right now. It is certainly very different from when it started to be a bishop as a vocation in the early church. Totally different. It has nothing to do almost.
And I do think, like, for example, in the last 20 years, there's been the development of, this, what they call the baby bishop school. But it's a pretty intensive week or 10 days that new bishops come to Rome. And it's not the spiritual, you are a bishop now kind of thing. It's real practical things about running a diocese, financial responsibilities, practical how to handle accusations of clerical sexual abuse. It's something that I think in a very practical way at the beginning of their ministry reminds bishops that they are being held to account, not just on the sexual abuse issue, but financially and in other ways. I don't think bishops are just kind of out there kind of running their own dioceses without answering to anyone. I don't think you can do that in the modern world.
Right.
There's a couple of other, we have time for just a couple more questions. One of them relates to what you just talked about, Massimo. Could you talk a little bit about the new position of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors? What kinds of changes might we see on a practical level that we haven't seen in the past?
The most important thing is that it is now part of the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith, but it has a separate president. So that could give this commission more authority, more weight within the Curia. Much will depend on its relationship with the rest of the dicastery for the faith. It is no longer in that limbo where it lived in the previous 8 years. Now it is more stable, it is more clear. We still don't know. It's too early to know if it is stronger, if it has more authority or not.
Remains to be seen.
Yes.
And here's one final question. To what extent is this reform merely aspirational? Many of our local experiences of the synod on synodality seems to have been totally missed in the point that the Pope is trying to make. Could the same happen here?
I think it's more difficult here. I think it is more difficult. This is a constitution, it's a papal document. Francis is not afraid of not being liked, but he's pretty clear when there's something that needs to be respected, like he said in these last few years on Vatican II, the liturgical reform. So I think this will take shape much more easily in Rome than other local reforms.
I think that's true also because the Constitution didn't just drop from the sky or fly off his desk. I mean, it's been in the works for 9 years, prepared for by some of the changes already having taken place over the last 5 or 6 years, including like the dicastery for integral human development or laity, family, and life, that those regroupings of those offices. But I think also and especially the Pope's speeches every Christmas time to the superiors of the Roman Curia have made it very clear what he thinks service in the Roman Curia should be. And that was 8-9 years of preparation before the document came out. Very clear, very explicit. And in the same time, he's had 9 years to appoint the kind of people to those offices who would be amenable to acting in concert with his vision. So.
And these questions just keep coming, but one final question here is, you've kind of both alluded to this, but just as a little summary of what we've talked about, how do you see this document and the reform of the Curia as being part of Francis' greater vision for the church?
I think Francis is a global pope for a global Catholic Church, but with a keen sense of the role of Rome, of the Vatican. I mean, Jesuits have always been at the borders of cultures and so on, but they always kept very strong connections with Rome. And he's one of them, and he has brought that to his ministry as a pope, I think. And
I think kind of even on a more basic level, if you read the Constitution and you read Evangelii Gaudium from the beginning of his pontificate, which set out kind of his vision, it's, if we're not missionaries, then what are we doing here? If we're not sharing Jesus with the world, then we might as well just close the doors and go home. And I mean, that's essential to his message. I mean, it has been for previous popes as well, obviously, but his focus is we've got to get back to that basic message of sharing God's love and the joy of being a believer.
So for Pope Francis, reforming the Curia is really getting us back to entering into that joy of the gospel that he started his pontificate with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time together here. So a huge thanks to both of you, Massimo and Cindy, for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. This was a really interesting and enlightening conversation that obviously could have continued on much longer. The chat box has been really, really active. I'd like to remind everyone that Massimo's book is available at a special discount for all the attendees. You can visit litpress.org, or you can order by phone. The number and the promo code that you need for that are on your screen. And as mentioned at the beginning, everyone who registered for this event will receive an email with a link to today's conversation. So please keep an eye on your inbox for that. It's been great having you with us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at future Liturgical Press online events. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Therese.
Bye-bye.
Thank you both.